the Rusyns, a people forged in the valleys and mountain peaks of the Carpathians, far away from the centralized control of the nations around them. At least, that is how things once were. An unfortunate reality is that few other peoples in the last century have gone through as many eras of horror as the Carpatho-Rusyns. These, what we can call national traumas, have molded our people's culture and politics, often not for the better. But what are these traumas, and what exactly happened? This is what we will be learning about today. The Decades of Silence was the period between 1945 and 1991, when all countries Rusyns resided in, besides Yugoslavia, outlawed the Rusyn identity and language. The ties between us and our heritage were torn away without regard for the consequences. Any communication between those in the homeland and the diaspora was cut off, and the same was true even between Rusyn regions. Hard borders between the USSR and various Soviet satellite states meant that any dialogue stopped completely. The Greek Catholic Church was also prosecuted, with many of our religious leaders being executed by Soviet authorities, with the rest having to work underground if they wanted to survive. During this time, our people were forced to take on new ethnic identities and go to specific schools for these that were created to foster their artificial conversion. The Rusyn language became the Zakarpathian dialect, and the Rusyn culture to Transcarpathian culture. Only after the fall of the Iron Curtain in 1991 did this begin to change for the better. The LMC Ethnos Side was the ethnic cleansing and forced assimilation policy conducted by the Polish government against the Lemko-Rusyn people that began in 1945 and ended in 1947, when the last Lemkos were exiled to Western Poland. When understanding why we date the start of this ethnocide in 1945 instead of 1947, it's important to understand that Operation Wisla, or Akcja Wisla, was not the only displacement event that occurred in the region. As was common in the 20th century, a policy of Rusyn erasure occurred, where Lemko-Rusyns were labeled as Ukrainians even with evidence to the contrary. Lemko-Rusyns would be grouped with those in the Ukrainian Insurgent Army, or the UPA, by local authorities, even though their population had little to do with this foreign force. Multiple population exchanges occurred with populations of Lemko-Rusyns and Ukrainians in the border regions further north being sent into Soviet Ukraine as far as the Donbass. By the time of Akcja Wisła, there had already been severe depopulation of both the northern native Ukrainian regions and the Lemko-Rusyn ethnographic areas. At this point, it was merely an effort to finish the job. In the aftermath of Akcja Wisła, there was a purposeful purge of any Lemko heritage visible to the land. Entire towns are now missing, with any buildings or structures that were once there being torn down, and the churches that still remained were forcefully converted from Orthodox and Greek Catholic denominations to Roman Catholic ones. Still today, many are Roman Catholic and attended by the descendants of new Polish immigrants. The Lemkos thrown west were not even kept together either, as the population would spread out across many provinces. No official Polish government programs or assistance has been made to help undo the damage that was done. 30 years before the Lemko Ethnos Side and the Decades of Silence, a different horrific era in Rusyn history befell Lemkowina. Peasants, educators, activists, and members of the Lemko intelligentsia will be subjected to some of the worst actions ever committed by Austrian authorities. The era I am referring to is known as the Austrian Terror. It is marked by the destruction of Lemko life in the years between 1914 and 1918. For decades leading up to 1914, there had been a pervasive, skeptical view of the Lemkos and Lemkowina and the Ruthenians in eastern Galicia among Austrian officials. One can even go back as far as 1882, when Adolf Dobriansky, Ivan Naumovich, and others were put on trial for treason in Lviv for their views. In the months leading up to the war, plans were set out to contain the Lemko population. And in 1914, as the war was going horribly for the Austrians, these feelings of paranoia would only begin to grow. What were calculated strategic moves in theory turned out to be something of a coordinated mass fury by the army against the Lemko population. Searches of entire villages and the practice of being executed without trial for being a suspected spy or for holding unpatriotic views became commonplace. This would grow even worse after each military defeat. One of the people murdered in this way was the legendary priest Maxim Sandovich, who committed no crime and was murdered in Gorlice in 1914 at the start of the war. Those who survived extrajudicial killings, but unlucky enough to be selected by Austrian soldiers, were taken to railway stations and put into cattle cars. Eventually, after days in these, people would reach barren fields near the town of Graz in Austria. This would turn into the Tallerhof concentration camp eventually, but those who first arrived would have to sleep on the ground for months in the cold and the rain. Nearly the entirety of the Lemko intelligentsia would pass through this camp at some point in the 3 years it was open. 2,000 Lemko educators alone would be brought within that time span, with some estimating over 7,500 Rusyns in total. Though being sent to Tallerhof was not an immediate death sentence, a significant percentage of these Rusyns would die during their stay, whether this be due to executions from guards, terrible sanitary conditions, and starvation. This camp was essentially a prototype to the Nazi concentration camps of World War II, yet instead of a monument to remember what happened, an airport was built on top of the camp and the graves of the victims. Austria has never offered any apology for their crimes.